Well, good morning again, and here we are in Ephesians chapter 3. And one of the interesting things about the way this chapter begins is that Paul begins and breaks off from what he was previously saying. He starts as if he's going one way, then has a rethink, and changes subject and leaves the old sentence just hanging there. You can probably imagine the way it happened. Paul is under house arrest. He's got some freedoms. People are bringing in supplies, and he has a friend who's doing the scribing. We think that was the case because in most of his letters, Paul signs in his own hand at the end, implying the rest of it isn't. So he's there with his guard and the scribe, and he's dictating, he's in full flow, and suddenly he thinks to himself, hang on, I need to pause there. But of course, he hasn't got a back button. And so he leaves the sentence hanging and carries on with the new subject. Well, the rethink probably is he's been thinking about, the chapter opens, God has done for the sake of you Gentiles. And so he's thinking about that, and he realizes that instead of going on to talk about prayer, which is what the chapter continues with halfway down, he needs just to help them think about in what way he's been called to act for the sake of you Gentiles. Well, he has a couple of things that he highlights. In verse 2, he says that God revealed the mystery to him. So let's read the verse. It says, "For this reason, I, Paul, a prisoner of Christ Jesus, for the sake of you Gentiles," and he pauses, "surely you've heard about the administration of God's grace that was given to me for you." And he goes on from there. So in verse 2, he says that God revealed the mystery to him for then. And in verse 7, he says that God called him to preach this to the Gentiles. So the two things are linked. There's like the divine revelation of a mystery to him, and then a divine call later on to preach it to others. And they're linked by a phrase that appears in both verses 2 and 7 that's all about grace. He talks about it in verse 2. You've heard about the administration of God's grace that was given to me. And that same phrase appears in verse 7. I become a servant of this gospel by the gift of God's grace given to me. It's the same wording in the original. God's grace revealed the mystery to him, and God's grace commissioned him to preach to them. And what marks Paul out is his sense of this grace in the way God has dealt with him. His sense is just enormous of the grace that he's been shown. Because if you look at his personal history, you discover that he had once despised Christians. He had hated what they stood for, and he persecuted them. You go back to Acts chapter 9, there's a description of the persecution that breaks out, and Saul is breathing out murderous threats against the disciples. And in part of his obsession to persecute them, he obtains letters from the high priest to go to the synagogues in Damascus and arrest Christians there who had converted. I don't think he was carrying out a citywide persecution in Damascus itself, but amongst the synagogues of those who had come to believe in Jesus. But on the way to Damascus, he encounters the risen Christ. He's thrown to the ground, and Jesus asks him, "Saul, why do you persecute me?" He says, "Who are you, Lord?" Because he knows this is a vision of God. And then he's horrified to learn that this vision is in fact of Jesus. And so in this awful moment, he realizes that he's been attacking God. Not just a renegade bunch of disciples, but God himself. Which is why in later life, when he assesses himself and thinks about himself in 1 Timothy, he says that he'd been a blasphemer, a persecutor, and a violent man. And all of those combine to create a character that he knows is not worthy of forgiveness. And so in his life, he could never get over God's grace. Because in the system he'd grown up with, the Pharisaic laws he followed, he would not have been forgiven. There was no sin, there was no sacrifice in the Old Testament for what was called sin with a high hand, in which you blatantly and deliberately and overtly attacked and rejected God. And that's what he was doing, he realized. Perhaps that's why he was chosen for this task. This man experiences God's grace at its greatest for a sin that he would never have forgiven himself or others. And then he's called to preach that grace to a group of people that he would never previously have accepted, who he felt were outside of that reach. And yet now he discovers wonderfully are in. It's all about grace. That's the great news. That's Paul's life, and it's true for me and for you too. Do you realize how much grace has been operating in your life? And what difference does it make to you? I'll leave you with that thought, and we'll take up a bit more from Ephesians 3 tomorrow.